Welcome back to the Cyber Leaders Exchange for part two of our panel on software security. My guests today are Angel Phaneuf, the Chief Information Security Officer for the Army Software Factory, Shane Barney, the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Homeland Security Department, and Tim Amerson, the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the Social Security Administration. We've been talking a lot about this idea of software bill of materials, other ways to ensure there's dealing with the risk of the software development itself. The other side of the coin, of course, is the supply chain itself. And can you trust the supply chain? Can you maintain provenance over the supply chain, both internal, external, third-party components and the like? Big issue around the government supply chain. What are you all doing specifically around that piece of third-party and supply chain provenance?
Yeah, thank you for this one. So trying to get the supply chain, and keep in mind, supply chain hits both, hardware and software. So I think the hardware one is pretty simplistic in nature. The vendors coming to the table with transparency and talking about where things are manufactured, designed from. I think those are good, easy, hard questions, but getting the vendors to be transparent when they come to the table. I think this whole secure by design model that CISO is trying to get everyone to come to the table with this, take a secure by design pledge, right? And that's saying that you are doing this, you are following the best practices. But I really want to know who you're doing business with and how are you maintaining that that security of those pipelines with those partnerships that you're doing businesses with. Example that I use is there's a big vendor out there that had a piece of their software in their portfolio that they sold off to a country that wasn't part of what we consider to be favorable. Two large government agencies utilize that capability within their environments, and we were not I didn't say we, as in the agencies were not even communicated. It took a senior engagement to have a conversation to figure out how we're going to secure that pipeline from a U.S. perspective. So that transparency is critical when we get ready to do business with the government. But the question is, how are we empowering our acquisition community with that understanding? How we, when you talk about market research and all the way through to the procurement process, ensuring that they understand that supply chain, that information is being fed during that process, and then bring in your cybersecurity teams in to understand some of that information that comes to that vendor. So I think that's a critical piece. You look at the attestation collection, that CISO led to the collecting the attestation piece of that process. But once again, that's just a collection of, hey, this is what we do, but still getting that information to the level that we can actually action on it. And then how do you have continuous monitoring? Vendor X said, this is who they're partnered with, this is where their software comes from, this is who works on it today. But when vendor X makes a stakeholder decision tomorrow that brings in another third party that we would consider to be unfavorable, how are we in the know, and how do we maintain visibility of that?
Tim, I'd love to delve deeper into the who, the what, the when, why, and how, which I know you won't tell me too much. But when you brought this to the attention of the senior leaders, did they understand why they should have, or in many ways, it's incumbent on them to tell you that they made this sale, or they were like, what's the problem? Did they not understand the challenge?
So the engagement with the vendor was clearly understood. But I think at the end of the day, it's this partnership that I see CISO doing to try to educate these vendors. If you're going to do business with the government, I really like what DoD is doing with the CMMC. I think that's a step in the right direction. And I think the executive order 14028 is a step in the right direction. I think the next one's going to be another step in the right direction that literally says, cybersecurity is a team sport. We need everyone to be transparent and upfront, so that we can continue to secure our nation's data.
Shane, same question for you around the supply chain piece. I think what Tim brought up, this idea of the transparency, and then how do you empower the acquisition folks with that information? Walk me through a little bit of how you're looking at this.
Supply chain, when it first started, I mean, this really hit hard several years ago, and there was a lot of hoopla about it and everyone getting all excited. And it was focused heavily on the hardware side of the house, which of course there's an easy understanding of that, chip manufacturing and the like. And of course, assembly and all that goes into that, and how things can be baked in, and various aspects of the supply chain that go into that type of security. But at the time, USCIS obviously is this heavy cloud user. It wasn't so much the hardware side of it as much as it was the code practices. I've always said, if our infrastructure is all code, our security is all code, then in an aspect, a large chunk of our supply chain is code too. And I don't think it really came home to roost too well until CrowdStrike, did us the solid and kind of helped the leadership understand the true impact of what that could have. And we were impacted by it. We use CrowdStrike, that's public knowledge, and we did have impacts across our organization that really hampered and took some time for us to resolve and move forward on, just as was very publicly made known for a lot of vendors or a lot of organizations that use CrowdStrike, both on the public and private sides. So really, when we start talking about supply chain risks and third-party risks, that's a very broad, that's a really broad question. And I don't think there's a magic bullet for it. I wish there was. And if there is, then I don't know if we've thought of it yet.
Let me interrupt. Is there some data that you guys are leaning on to say we can trust these vendors or this vendor? Are you starting to feed your security folks or your acquisition folks any of that kind of?
So obviously we've done simple things. FedRAMP authorization is a requirement for us. And I won't sponsor FedRAMP for my own. That's a different conversation, different day.
Different panel.
But that's one piece of that, right? There is this external third party that's sort of authorizing it. I prefer that they've had a third party, attestation of their overall practices that certifies them, and not some government agency. But those are pieces to that puzzle. Is it sufficient? I don't think so. Right. There's a lot that goes into modern applications and especially the stuff that we're leveraging. And I think that Tim hit right on the head when you start talking about it's not the primary producer; it's these third parties that are below that. It's like tertiary, and then it goes. I don't even know what's the next level down. You just keep going. There are multiple risks supply chains. We saw this with Okta several years ago, where they had one of their third-party suppliers who compromised their environment, and that rippled up. So it's far more complex, I think, of a question to answer and address than just simply, we'll just do software attestation and SBOM, and I think we're good. I don't think that's it. I wish I don't really have a solid answer for how to fix it. I think a step in the right direction is that sort of agreement between organizations. The pledge, actually, honestly, a pledge is only as valuable as everyone's willingness to stick to it. I'm also a CISO, so I'm super paranoid. And I want trust but verify. So there's got to be a balance there. We've got to figure out that balance and what information I need on my side to feel comfortable that you really are adhering to that pledge. Obviously there's the easier ones at the top. Major changes in your supply chain, obviously, is a big one. But that in and of itself wouldn't tell you that something was wrong. It really helps in the after the fact and when you're doing the investigation side of it, but how do we get in front of it? How do we become, how do we prevent it as opposed to respond? And I think that's what everyone's struggling to try to figure out. It's that, how do we get in front of it as opposed to reacting every single time it happens?
Angel, do you have the answer to Shane? How do you get in front of it? What's the Army doing around supply chain?
From my pocket, my corner of the woods, we only buy from trusted sources and approved sources, but then we treat everyone the same. Scan all code containers, infrastructure as code before it's deployed. So just because you are a vetted person or a vetted company that we can get our stuff from doesn't mean that I'm going to treat you any differently than not, because just because you're a vetted company doesn't mean that you're not going to have vulnerabilities, or you're not going to have an insider threat, or you're not going to have some issue like CrowdStrike and Okta both had. So I think for this instance, it's okay to buy from buy the book, is really a great way. We only purchase from trusted approved sources, vetted by proper DoD personnel. It is very difficult to bring in new software into these spaces because of the threat vector. And that is a challenge. And Shane, I agree with you. I wish, there was a better process than just FedRAMP. I wish that FedRAMP, the companies that had to go through that, there was a different process for them as well. But we're also lagging on our ability to bring in new modern technology with some of the antiquated processes of bringing in new software in through the DoD. So it's a challenge, but I just continue to trust but verify everyone, because I too am also paranoid.
It really truly is. I mean, we've got to strike some sort of balance between we need to move forward, modernize, and continue down that path. We can't just sit stagnant. That doesn't work, not in this modern environment. Which means we can't allow the current processes, which especially things like FedRAMP and even FISMA to some degree, which really was only last updated in 2014. So in IT terms, just 1,000 years. We've got to modernize all those pieces and parts to catch up to where we're at so that we can get in front of that and give us the tools and capabilities that we need to actually do the work and to be paranoid and be good paranoid CISOs. And that requires that data. And then, having that public-private partnership for me is really critical. We've talked a little bit about it. We've all talked about it. And really, what does that mean? What does that partnership look like going forward? And it's got to be a partnership of equality. And that's a tough thing to do.
So I think Angel hit it. You secure everything. That trust but verify. If you think about the right, I'm going to use the word, zero trust model. That principle is the foundation of where we're going as a government practice. And so when you think about that clearly, you have to assume compromise. Well, if you have to assume compromise, what are you doing today to mitigate the compromise that you're assuming? So there's a reason why they say you have to assume compromise, because your day-to-day practice as a paranoid CISO is to find that assumption and validate it, right? Every assumption has to be validated. You can't just leave it there. It has to continue to be validated. So I love what she said on that. I think that's how we build in our systems to constantly validate the security of what they said they do and what our pipelines say that they will do as well. So that's even including some third-party stuff. I think we partnered with CISA to do some what they call the FAST program, which is basically the Federal Attack Service Testing. So getting that constant third-party assessment, not just your internal ones, but also your external one partners, and constantly checking yourself and constantly getting feedback on how well everything's going. So I just wanted to add that point. Sorry I had to throw zero trust. I know this is software security, but I thought we had to say it.
Can't beat a good zero trust discussion. Well, it's a great segue, but Tim, you piqued my interest on working with CISA. When you went through that process, the FAST process, how much did you learn about what you were doing or are doing? Where did you find, generally speaking, knowing that there's some sensitivities, potential areas of improvement? Talk a little bit about that experience with CISA.
We have no findings in that process. Going through it was basically, you looked at it from availability perspective. You had to make sure that what they're going to set up and do isn't going to cause an outage in your agency, because there are some hits against your external facing capabilities and services. So we had to go through and make sure we were monitoring and saw no degradation to our customers when they're utilizing our outward facing services. And then we get the reports back from them, and we go through whatever findings they have, and we've been very successful. So basically our pipeline is working so far, and we will continue to partner that and continue to consider it to be an invaluable service that they're providing.
It's a good segue, because one of the things that when we talk about, we know a lot of industry will be watching this session. Gives you that opportunity to say, okay, what can they do? If it's a partnership, if there's transparency, if it's more than just a pledge, what can industry do really to do more to kind of make you more confident around the security of the software? Maybe Angel, I'll ask you to start on that one, and then we'll work kind of backwards.
So I think my personal opinion, not necessarily the opinion of others that work in my area, but my personal opinion would be to be upfront with your vulnerability assessment reports. Anytime that I've asked a vendor for their vulnerability assessment reports or what it looks like, oh, they have no findings. How is that possible? Like, there has to have been a progression. You had to have had findings, go and fix it, had findings. And I think the reason why that matters to me is because I think we've seen a lot of these cyber attacks that consistently happen that that are very similar. They're just small adjustments. So seeing how they respond to cyber attacks or how they're responding to their vulnerabilities and the adjustments that they're making allows me to see if the company is actually serious on their security and wanting to do business and safeguarding the information that we safeguard. So for me, I love to be able to see their vulnerability assessment reports. I love to see their documentation that they're actually following those steps and understand how the company's actually working, rather than just they're throwing a product to market and saying, come use it, it's great, it's awesome, but they've never done a vulnerability scan and they've never done a code review and they've never gone down a security automated pipeline. It's just a couple of folks trying to get a product out and sell it to the government. And I've seen that many times. So documentation, those vulnerability assessment reports, and being honest about, the trials that you go through, trying to build something to find a solution for us to be able to use inside of the DoD. So that's my personal opinion on that. Something that I think I've seen very little from industry. I've seen it a lot from the bigger vendors, but for maybe smaller companies that are trying to break into this space, I see less of that.
Tim, same question. What's your kind of message to the industry about what you like to see them to make you more confident?
Yeah, thank you. So definitely transparency across the board. I don't want to continue to echo what Angel said, but she's spot on. We have to this is a partnership. When you're working with the federal government, it's not a sell, it's a partnership, because we have to have a vested interest in one thing, and that's our citizens' data and services. And so that partnership we take very seriously, and we need to see that you're taking it very seriously. Well, so when you start to do that transparency, we brought up CrowdStrike, but did we bring up the fact that they actually owned up to their issue immediately? That was amazing to see. And they immediately talked about where they did wrong. And they immediately showed us where they're going to do better. And they immediately started to rectify and own everything. That's a vendor that, are you going to leave now because they made a mistake? Or are you going to stay with, because not only did they own their mistake, they learned from their mistake and they're better off from it. So that's why this transparency is so valuable. And when you show that you went through that pathway, there's a lot to learn on the other side. So I 100% agree that you have to, be willing to show those things. And then let's go from there.
Shane, there's one thing I've learned in covering the government for a few decades now. The government always feels better when you apologize for what you did and admit your mistake versus pushing it off. There's more people in jail for lying to the government than probably for doing wrong. Again, I'm not asking you to lie to the government, but
Thank you.
I will ask you, what are you looking for vendors? What gets them in your good graces?
Well, obviously, we talked about transparency, and I could not agree more. Transparency is everything. Usually what's good for them is probably good for us as well, and vice versa. And it's got to be a two-way discussion. In other words, I can't be close-hold and not share as well to the extent possible under law and regulations, and we should. That should be that back and forth. I think the accountability piece is really critical. I've always thought about, when SolarWinds first hit, and FireEye, I think was one of the companies that first reported it, and really just sort of opened everything up and said, hey, this is how we have been compromised. They were a big cybersecurity vendor to the federal space and to even as well as the commercial space. I can only imagine what that boardroom discussion must have been like, knowing full well that going big, going public, as it were, there was a potential ramification back financially to that company. Yet they did it anyway, and I had all the respect for them in the world because of that. They knew that this was the right thing to do. This was the right way to go about it, and they approached it. And I think CrowdStrike did something very similar. Now, CrowdStrike got beat up for a bunch of other different reasons, some of them legit, some of them not. But the reality is they did own up to what had happened. They took very active steps. And not only that, they took a lot of really good feedback from the people who were impacted to how changes should be made so that going forward, we can maybe avoid these, whether it was ring deployments internally or the ability to better control how updates are handled and things like that. They also were very transparent about how the QA pieces that they had messed up on and where that was going to be addressed and how that would be addressed. And then they did follow up, which a lot of people didn't talk about. They actually came back in later and showed us how they'd actually made these changes. So these are all really great examples of what both that transparency, but both the accountability piece, because there's follow-up that's required. Because, like I said, if you want to maintain a good relationship, we're all going to make mistakes, but trust is built upon owning your mistakes, not necessarily, never making a mistake. And so I think that owning that mistake and living up to it and on our side as well as theirs, and then sharing an ongoing story about how that happened and where you're going, what's changing internally it's going to be critical. And then of course that ongoing sharing. We do not get enough data from a lot of our third-party vendors. I wish we got more. At least give me the option to turn it down as opposed to turning it up.
Well, Shane, on that note, Tim, Angel, we're out of time for this session of the Cyber Leaders Exchange, so I will thank my guests. Angel Phaneuf is the Chief Information Security Officer for the Army Software Factory. Shane Barney is the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Homeland Security Department. And Tim Amerson is the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer at the Social Security Administration. Tim, Angel, Shane, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you're watching Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more from the Cyber Leaders Exchange.